Very good afternoon and welcome to this EPC briefing on the war in Ukraine, the implications for Finland and Europe. I'm Annika Hedberg, I'm Head of Sustainable Prosperity for Europe program at EPC, and I'll be discussing today with Professor Alexander Stubb, Director of the School of Transnational Governance at EUI, about where we are and where we may be heading as the Russian war in Europe on Ukraine continues. As a former Finnish Prime Minister, Finance Minister, Foreign Minister, Trade and Europe Minister, as well as a former member of the Finnish and European Parliaments, and much more, you certainly have seen a lot. And it's wonderful to have you join us and try to make sense of, or at least some sense of the implications of this war. We see that Finland has received plenty of attention in the last weeks because of its history, a long border, and relations with Russia. And we look forward to having you reflect on the Finnish perspective on the war in Ukraine. But this is not all. And as we have you at the EPC, it will be very interesting to hear also your thoughts on the European failures that led to the war, Putin's agenda, the EU's response, as well as the implications of Russian war for Ukraine, the EU, and Europe as a whole. For our audience, I would like to mention that I'll start with a number of questions to Alex. And after a while, I'll turn to you for your questions and comments. And if you're interested to ask a question, you can either click on the hand icon if you wish to speak, or alternatively, you can use the space provided to ask short written questions. Alex, let's start with the Finnish perspective to the war. When Russia attacked Ukraine on the 24th of February, many were immediately making links to the Russian invasion of Finland in 1939. What do you think? What are some of the differences and similarities that you would identify between the Finnish Winter War and Russian war in Ukraine?
Oh, thanks, Annika, first of all, for having me. And yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of the sort of international conversations that I've had, there are a lot of reoccurring themes linked to Finland. One of them, of course, is the Winter War. One is the concept of Finlandisation, and the third one is the term neutrality. And, you know, though there are similarities, obviously any conflict and war situation is actually quite different. On the Winter War, you could say that the basic script is very similar, the way in which wars start, you know. But probably the one that I was looking at more closely was the war in Georgia in 2008, where I was mediating peace with Bernard Kouchner. So what usually happens is that first there's this sort of disinformation campaign, which escalates the public communication. Then after that, there's a movement of troops. After that, there's some military exercises. Then after that, you sort of try to get the conflict going by a fake attack. That's what happened in the Winter War with the shots in Mainila. And obviously they were trying to get the same thing to happen somewhere around Luhansk and Donetsk. Then after that, there is a declaration of recognition of the areas from the Russian part in Donetsk and Luhansk. And then finally, there's a sending of peacekeeping troops. And I sort of thought it would stop there and that we were looking at another frozen conflict like South Ossetia and Abkhazia or like the Crimean Peninsula. But then when the sort of full-scale war went on, I, like many other pundits, were taken aback and quite surprised.
Oh, absolutely. You yourself, you mentioned and you've
the F word.
Exactly, Finlandisation. And there's been a lot of talk about Finlandisation recently. So can you explain how you understand the concept and what this meant for Finland?
So you want me to explain it in a calm, cool, and collected manner without getting frustrated?
If you can.
Okay, so you know, everyone on the screen, just to let you know that it's a concept that was coined by a German professor in the 1960s. I think 1966, if I remember correctly. And the concept for us is a very sore point in our history, in the sense that it was a time when we had to compromise our values. Remember that Finland was one of the first, actually the first country in the world to give women the right to vote. And, you know, we always very strongly believed in democracy. But during the Cold War and during the period of what some people want to call Finlandisation, we had to give in on a lot of our basic values. So the example that I give is Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which was basically banned from publication in Finland and had to be published in Sweden. The other example I give is that the Kremlin was basically able to guide Finnish domestic politics and say who would be in government and when, where, and how. And on top of that, there was an extension of the mandate of our then president, Urho Kekkonen, who was there for, a quarter of a century. You can, question whether it was democratic or not, but the basic argument was that he has good relations with the Soviet Union. We cannot afford to let him go. So when people were in the beginning of the conflict, talking about Finlandisation or using Finland as an example, I had to sort of fight it off and say, it's the last thing you want to do, because then you're basically, I would argue, limiting the sovereignty or freedom or the space in which the Ukrainians would take their own decisions. So I felt that from the beginning it was very much counterproductive and I would say ahistorical argument, apart from obviously being highly offensive to us Western-oriented Finns.
And in case of Finland, when did Finlandisation actually end?
Good question. And I know that there might be some media online, so I'll be very careful with what I was saying, because in Finland, this is still a sore point. But, I'll frame it like this. It was probably at its heaviest and at its height in the 1970s, perhaps even in the 1980s. There were some political movements, parties, which were very close to their Soviet counterparts at the time. But I would also argue that actually it didn't even disappear fully post Cold War. There were still some elements in our society who felt that they somehow needed to have contact with it, which at times were a little bit too intimate for my liking, with the Russians. Nowadays, it's very difficult for anyone in Finland to be Finlandized, not least because of the situation as it stands right now. But as I said, I'd love to drop the F word.
We'll drop the F word, but then another concept that is often being linked to Finland is that we're a neutral state. And some have also suggested this kind of a model of neutrality as a solution for Ukraine. So how would you react to such?
First reaction is, again, don't do it. And you have to understand that, during the Cold War, we were basically neutral because of necessity, not ideology. So we never felt that we can be neutral in the face of a grand aggressor like the Soviet Union. But we fully realized that we have, 1,340 kilometers of border with Russia. And that basically entailed that in order for us to survive as a nation, we had to abide by this notion of neutrality. So for all of the EU nerds in Brussels, you might remember that Finland couldn't even join EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, or the Free Trade Agreement Association. And the reason for that package was we went to something called FinEFTA, which was a separate agreement. We weren't even members of the Council of Europe, from which Russia was just, by the way, sacked. Until the 1980s. So the moment, and the Russians in the beginning, the Soviets didn't recognize our neutrality. It only happened later, I think in the 1980s. So it was by necessity, not by ideology, unlike Sweden, which was neutral, or Switzerland. So very different type of neutrality. So when the Cold War ended, we were able immediately to integrate into the Western institutions where we wanted to go. The European Union being a prime example, including, of course, then going in to the euro. Had it been up to me at the time, I was a young student, but then in '95 I was negotiating the Amsterdam Treaty as a young civil servant at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. I thought that would have been the ideal time to go into NATO as well. But we dropped the concept of neutrality. We had this friendship agreement with the Soviet Union. We dismantled that. And then defined our foreign security policy doctrine as not belonging to a military alliance. But I always felt that we were immediately politically allied when we joined the European Union. And of course, nowadays, we're sending arms to Ukraine. We have a close partnership with NATO. Neutrality is a bit of an old school nostalgic term.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I think that Finland picked a side when it joined the EU and in the 95. So it's since then, it's very difficult to call us a neutral state anymore. So I think that's worth to keep in mind.
True that. And then to sort of suggest to Ukraine to be neutral, I think those Jeffrey Sachs and Matsukato in the early days of the conflict, made these types of suggestions. I mean, to a certain extent, it's quite uncomfortable in the sense that on one hand, you're saying that the Ukrainians should have the right to decide themselves on which club they want to join. And on the other hand, you're saying, well, they should be neutral. And I don't think anyone can do that. And to be honest, looking at what's going on in Ukraine at the moment, and, we're into the third or actually fourth week of the war now, neutrality is the last thing that the Ukrainians are thinking about at the moment. Some of the terminology is floated around. There was an FT article yesterday about the potential 15-point ceasefire agreement. To be honest, this is where, realism meets idealism, as nice as it would sound. I just don't think it's going to happen. This is not Georgia in 2008. The stakes are much higher for Putin. This is about his legacy. This is about his vision. This is about his mission. This is about his obsession. He's not going to let this go. And I just don't see any space for a ceasefire agreement at the moment.
Yeah. Going back still to Finland, something that we've seen is that over the years, Finland has developed very strong economic and energy relations with Russia. And so 2 questions on that. How would you describe Russia's importance for Finnish businesses and economy as a whole? And what implications do you think that the war, the sanctions, and perhaps even ending business operations in Russia now for good, what kind of implications would this have for the Finnish economy?
Sure thing. A few observations on that. I think you need to rewind all the way back to the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, when we in Finland basically had a double whammy. On one hand, a financial crisis driven by the banking sector. On the other hand, the total collapse of trade with the Soviet Union, which at the time was partially barter trade, believe it or not. And then, of course, partially normal trade. But it was about 20% of our economy. So, it was a really, really hard hit. And I think a lot of people still have a memory of those times, which is a rather harsh one. There's still bankruptcies linked to that time that are being dealt with, and kind of a feeling that never again. Then over the years, after our trade having gone down to almost zero, we brought it up to more or less 10% where it's standing at the moment. And this then leads me to my second observation. There are countries that are going to be hard hit by the sanctions with Russia. There's no sort of doubt about that. I mean, I happen to have at home my wife, who is the head of global compliance for Kone, the elevator makers, right? So their business portfolio in Russia is not huge, but it's there. So I've seen sort of looking at sort of across the table at the engine room of how you deal with these types of crisis and sanction situations. But then there are huge companies like Fortum, which is an energy company which has stakes. I can't even give you the figures, but we're talking a few billion. And funnily enough, by the way, the last time I saw Putin was together with President Niinistö opening a power plant of Fortum's in somewhere in Siberia in 2014, I think it was, or 2013. So, it's a big part of it. So it's going to be hit quite hard, but I'm very positively surprised that the sort of reaction of Finnish business, it was almost immediate. I mean, we're talking, if not hours, days, when they understood that, okay, we need to start, counting this down. My take is that if and when this war continues, Russia is going to be fully and utterly isolated. And by that, I mean to say that we will lose most, if not all, of the business that we've had with Russia. And you basically have to count this as a factor already, no matter what you're doing in business. So it's going to be isolated politically, it's going to be isolated economically, it's going to be isolated from finance perspective, sports, culture, transport, and I think eventually energy as well. I mean, energy is a difficult issue in the sense that you can't run it down immediately, because say, for instance, that you were to cut all the oil exports or all the gas exports, that will have a price effect, which might actually paradoxically have a positive effect on Russia. So you have to do it step by step, if you will. A final point, an observation I wanted to make on Finland and Russia and energy. Some of the international pundits, or well, perhaps not pundits, but commentators and media are taking some of the things completely out of context. So the example I give is that, in Finland, it's almost 100% of our gas comes from Russia. But you see, you have to put it into context. About 5 to 7% of our energy production comes from gas. So if Russian gas were to be switched off, we can switch to alternative sources immediately. For instance, nuclear. And I know this is an unpopular view, but all I'm saying is that if we didn't have nuclear power plants in Finland, we'd be in deep trouble. It was serious trouble. So we were able to diversify our energy portfolio over the years. With hindsight, it was very intelligent, I think, for whoever was taking the decisions at the time. Because we understood that energy can become a security issue. So yeah, please understand that Finland will be hit very hard. But to be honest, I don't see too many people complaining in Finland. So one other thing, ice hockey is big for us, right? So there was a Finnish ice hockey team, and I don't say this because I support the opposite team. But they went to the KHL, which is basically an attempt of Russia to create the National Hockey League in Russia. And that, of course, is soft power, but they had to withdraw from the league immediately, from the playoffs. A lot of the players, many of them Finns actually, are coming home. And I think Jokerit, the team, will pull out. So a lot of ramifications in different kinds of ways.
Absolutely. Staying on energy, I would like to pick on one example. Finland obviously has had its share of questionable projects with Russia. And a good example is the Fennovoima nuclear project, which was to be built with Russian nuclear energy corporation Rosatom. And it was criticized heavily in Finland when it was approved in 2015. And you yourself, you were in the government at the time and downplayed the fears of those that were concerned about the possible political and security implications of this Russian-built nuclear plant. Can you tell us what happened and what lessons can we take from this?
I mean, I can tell half of the story as one always can in these types of situations. I guess the first observation to say is that, we were at the time trying to maximize the number of new nuclear reactors and power plants that we could build. So the sort of arch of the story is a little bit longer than the decision taken in 2014, and then the decision actually to move ahead with Rosatom in 2015. So at one stage, I think I was Prime Minister. In the next phase, I was Finance Minister. And the answer that I've given to the Finnish media, and I still, say it like this, and I'm very sort of bona fide open about it. With the information that we had at the time, the decision was what it was. With hindsight, I think it was a mistake, right? So, the interest of nuclear was put in above the interest of geopolitics. And in that sense, I wasn't the decision maker, but when you're the Prime Minister, it's your fault, or at least you should, under no circumstances, try to detach yourself from the decision. Now, I'm really glad that the current Finnish government is actually taking the opposite, and they basically shut it down. So it's not going to happen. But yeah, these types of things, when you export Russian oil, when you export Russian gas, and when you already have nuclear reactors which are Russian, like the ones that we have in Loviisa, you have to think that in our particular case, this is one way of expanding the energy portfolio. But with hindsight, you know, wrong decision, mistake. Unfortunately, the current government has made it null and void.
Yeah. And I'll be happy to come back to the European context on this, because obviously energy plays such a huge role, and obviously the imports of Russian fossil fuels play an extremely important role now in the discussions within the EU. So I'll be happy to come back to that, because it certainly is a sore point, I would say,
but
in Europe.
you know, one of the things, Annika, I would say at this stage is that, you know, if we take the big perspective, it's easy with hindsight to say that we, the Europeans, we were naive in two things. One, we have based our energy, or relied our energy on Russia, on our security on America. You know, I think this conflict, this war will probably change that. So, you know, I always try to look at the big picture, and it's very easy to do it from the sidelines. I think the disruption to the energy markets is going to be so big that it's actually going to drive the Green Deal much faster than what it might have been otherwise. I think it'll also rejuvenate the discussion and the debate about nuclear power, which I would welcome. You know, I'm a huge fan of Angela Merkel, but I think Energiewende was a mistake. And on the American side, you know, we have to understand. I mean, just think about it. I mean, what if we had Donald Trump as the president of the United States at the moment? You know, would you feel comfortable? You know, Joe Biden has obviously, you know, reinvigorated NATO, and, you know, he's flying to Brussels next week, et cetera, et cetera. But can you see, you know, so, you know, it'll force us to think a little bit long term. And I'm not saying this, you know, like, how would I say, from the more French traditional perspective that, you know, we need strategic autonomy and, you know, NATO is brain dead and the rest of it. No, that it's not about that. But we do have to start thinking long term about our security and how we manage that. And this is the thing I've been saying from a European perspective from the beginning. I mean, the EU always advances through crisis, right? Usually it's, you know, crisis, chaos, suboptimal solution. But this time around, I mean, you know, we just got a common foreign security and defense policy basically overnight. So in the financial crisis, it took us 4 years to set up the European Stability Mechanism. In COVID, it took us 4 months to set up next generation EU, the rescue package, mutualization of debt, and the rest of it. And now it took us four days basically to overturn German foreign security and defense policy to send 500 million euros worth of arms to Ukraine. So, and the thing is, these, you know, you don't step back from these decisions. Integration is such that once it's happened, you're not going to roll back the frontiers of the decision anymore.
Absolutely. And I actually would be very happy to pick on that. And when you're talking about the response from the EU side, would you like to evaluate a bit more? How do you see the reactions? Has this been fast enough? Has this been sufficient? Oh,
definitely. And I'm extremely impressed. And of course, I mean, everyone in the EPC and on the screen will know that I'm, you know, pro-European and I'm an EU nerd and the rest of it. And, you know, come hell or high water, I'll defend. But to be honest, I mean, look at what Ursula von der Leyen and her commission have done. I mean, and I've said this before, it's not the president that makes the agenda, it's the agenda that makes the president. And when there has been a power vacuum, like there was with COVID, you know, she went straight in there, seized the moment, seized the opportunity, and established a rescue package, procured vaccines. And now with this war, same thing. Yeah, the big diplomatic conversations still take place between, you know, Macron and Putin and Scholz and Putin and, you know, Niinistö and Putin and the rest of it. But look, you know, Borrell as well. You know, it's one of the toughest jobs you can have in Brussels is to be the high rep, because basically you're trying to put together 27 national foreign policies, and whatever you do, you're going to be criticized. But what does he do? Lavrov sends a letter and says, absolutely, everyone has to answer these separately. What does Borrell do? Hey, foreign minister, should we answer this collectively in my names? No problem, we'll do it. So, you know, I think the European Commission, the EU has really seized the opportunity here, and they've done a really good job. Then, of course, you can always criticize. But I also remember in the first days of the war, a lot of my friends were complaining, oh, the sanctions are too slow, and this is not happening. And I said, wait for it, wait for it, wait for it. And within 48 hours, you had sanction wave number 1, sanction wave number 2, and then another 24, you had sanction wave number 3. And that's when people realized that, okay, the EU is doing its bit here. So I think we did a hell of a lot better of a job than we did in 2008 or 2014.
And at the same time, I think we should be also very careful that we don't self-congratulate ourselves yet, because while we have, certainly the response has been reasonably robust and certainly better than some might have expected, the fact is that the war is still ongoing. Putin is moving on his design, and as long as the war continues, there certainly is more that we could do.
Yeah, I think, my big worry here is that, we'll go into this mode of war fatigue. I'm not saying that, Syria will happen, but the human mind is such that it has a limited attention span, especially a limited sort of span for coping with travesty, hardship, and death. And I think there are a few things that we need to continue to do. I mean, one is to show this solidarity, which we're doing. And I must say that the way in which President Zelensky is dealing with it, going live with Congress, going live with the Bundestag, and by the way, here on Saturday, going live to Santa Croce, a square here in Florence. So he's doing all the right moves in terms of keeping the momentum up. Secondly, we need to continue the arms exports. We're not going to be able to intervene ourselves, but the fact that we're providing the Ukrainians capacity to defend themselves is already half the battle. And remember, you always end up working much harder when you're defending your own country than when you're attacking another one, especially if you didn't even know that you were supposed to go there for an attack and you've been fed propaganda about what it's all about. Thirdly, we need to continue the financial aid. So this is sort of, and then fourthly, we must understand that there will be a moment when there's peace and reconstruction, and this is going to cost, and it's going to cost a hell of a lot. So that's on the Ukrainian side. Now we come back to the other side, because now, of course, no one has the audacity to start complaining about themselves in the middle of this war. But I think what European leaders need to do right now is to be crystal clear in their communication. They need to explain that peace has a price. This is going to cause inflation, higher energy prices, an economic downturn, potential unemployment, cuts into social benefits. I mean, this is the price that we pay for this war, and the fact that we have a authoritarian, totalitarian aggressor in the form of President Putin. And that's why I think the social bit of this needs to be dealt with in Europe. And you can already start seeing that now, we say, why should we be paying for the increased price of energy, say in Spain or in Italy or in Finland, or we should definitely not go for the mutualization of debt in this particular situation. So these sort of small cracks in solidarity. So far, solidarity is, unequivocal. It's 100%. That's fine. But remember, we're not far off the financial crisis when it was North versus South, and I was there in the North, not here in the South. And then in the migration crisis when it was about East versus West. The first time we've had relative solidarity, I say relative solidarity, was during COVID. But we need to have that solidarity in the future towards Ukraine, helping them out, and then for the rest of Europe as well. So that's going to be a really tough nut, I think, for our European leaders to crack in the coming months and years.
No, absolutely. And I'll be happy to pick on that. But another thing I would like to pick on is our dependence on Russian fossil fuels. This obviously is the huge issue on the table. And arguably the sanctions and the support for Ukraine means little as long as we, the EU member states, are and continue to sponsor the Russian war machine as we are doing, and when we are continuing to pay for Russian oil, gas, and coal. And taking Russia's dependence on European energy exports for its federal budget, the EU member states could send a serious blow to the Russian war efforts if they decided to drastically reduce or cut off the Russian fossil fuels with immediate effect. But this is really, it is a huge issue on the table. We see that, for example, Germany, which is highly dependent on Russian fossil fuels, is afraid of the economic consequences, including impact on employment. So on top of what you already said about the importance of communication, how would you assess this situation? What would be your message for countries such as Germany and others who are now afraid of the consequences of cutting off Russian fossil fuels?
Yeah, sure. First thing, just an observation on language. Have you noticed that in the past few weeks, no one is anymore talking about Russian oil or gas? Everyone is using the term Russian fossil fuels. Why is that? Because they have a very negative connotation, and you can sort of get into your mind this idea of a green transition while you have that conversation. First observation, I remember when being foreign minister and getting my first briefs on Russia somewhere in a bunker at the foreign ministry. I mean, the first thing I learned was that roughly 50% of Russian state income, so money that goes into their annual budget, comes from the export of, let's use the term now, fossil fuels, right? And when you are basically a petro economy, you're not going to be able to modernize. And that's obviously one of the sad things. Even though the Russians tried to set up, Skolkovo in the form of Silicon Valley and the rest of it, it was never going to happen. When you have those natural resources, it's very easy to get a little bit lazy with innovation and so on and so forth. Now, hitting the war machine, yes. A lot of times, though, these situations are quite simplified in the sense that, you see it as a zero-sum game. That, if we were to cut oil exports and gas exports at this particular moment, that would end feeding the Russian war machine. It's not that simple. So there are, of course, path dependencies here. There's no question about that. You get different types of figures of how dependent countries are. I sit here in Italy, in Florence, where, by the way, it's warm outside but always cold inside. But Italy is quite dependent on Russian gas. Germany as well. But I really want to look at it from the long perspective, as I said earlier. Two final points on this. So that means that there needs to be a gradual, firm, and clear roadmap on how we stop exporting Russian fossil fuels. And from what I understand, there's really clear plans in the European Commission how you do this. And it's also based on the type of calculations where we make sure that Russia doesn't benefit from this. I mean, it's all nice that the US says that we will not export any Russian oil anymore. Well, 7%. They know it's not going to have a price effect, nor do they know that it's going to damage the U.S. Economy. But then in the long run, we need to sort of wane ourselves off from it, and I see this as a positive development in disruptive development in the Green Deal and moving into clean energy. Of course, it's not as simple as I'm making it, but this is at least the vision that I have. So. This vision is as scientific and as exact as to say that, we're fit for 55. Well, I think we'll be fit for 45 with this pace. So we'll get things going a little bit quicker.
I think it's worth to keep in mind that when we're talking about the fossil fuels, both oil and coal are actually available on the global market. We're very much attached to the Russian gas, but actually oil, certainly, at least in my mind, should be the first thing which we would be looking at, because it's such an important source of revenue for Russia, but it is actually available on the global market. So it should be relatively easy for EU to discontinue these oil imports and actually at least cut off this sort of revenue.
Definitely. I mean, I don't know, I can only give you one example, which I don't know the details of, but Neste Oil is one of the biggest energy companies in Finland. And from what I understand, it exports all of its oil from Russia, and then it refines it and sells it. And it's actually a big part of Finnish exports and GDP as well. So, you know, they're going to have to look at alternative sources as soon as possible. But this is what war is about, and it's, you know, it's the cost that we have to pay for war. But I always want to see the silver lining in this, and the sooner we can detach ourselves from Russian exports, the better. Final point on this: I don't want to run ahead of the situation, but there is going to be a moment when there is potential regime change in Russia, and there is going to be a moment where we need to start the reconstruction of Russia as well. I just don't know how it's going to happen, and you know, how to get our minds around it. But I sort of hope that day will come. The only fear that I have here is that, you know, this war is so horrendous that it's going to stick to, you know, in our cognitive memory for such a long time, for our generation. You know, this is, if I may, this is worse than Hungary in 1956. At least in our memory, it's worse than, you know, Prague in 1968. This is a completely and utterly unnecessary, heinous attack by a totalitarian leader, and how we can then even begin to forget this, let alone how the Ukrainians will forget it, I simply don't know. But I don't know if you want to talk about Putin a little bit. Happy to give you a couple of pointers on that.
Absolutely. And I see that we have actually in the audience, I see that we have someone who has a hand up. So I'll be happy to come back to Putin, but maybe we'll let Philip Hammer-Trotz, as he has his hand up, to ask a question. My colleagues will unmute you so that you can pose your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Alexander Stubb, for this very clear information. Well, I'm talking from sunny north in Finland, very sunny and fine. But I would like to put at the table, quite bluntly, but a question, and referring to the main heading of this seminar, which is now in many Finnish citizens' minds, the very emerging uncertainty and hesitation. What will be the consequences on Finland in case there will be escalation of this war? So the question is, in your mind, would the independence of Finland be at threat? Would there be a risk for that Finland will be the next goal for Russian aggression? This is very bluntly questions, but they are questions which all of us have in our head now. Thank you very much. Yeah,
sure. No, thanks, Philip. I guess, I mean, the way in which I frame it is short term and long term, and the short term answer is very simple: that no, there is not a direct and imminent military threat on Finland, and therefore not a direct and imminent military threat on Finnish independence. And all of you on the screen have to understand that, you know, independence for a Finn means a lot. It's somewhere deep engraved in our DNA. We were part of Sweden up until 1809, and then an autonomous part of Russia, the Russian Empire, from 1809 to 1917. And then we said that in 1917, Lenin gave us our independence. But it's something which is really, really deep. And when you mention the word independence, it's there. So I haven't gone, Philip, as far as to think about the independence issue. But then there is the long term. And I think what people in Finland are thinking about right now, I mean, the thinking is driven by what I call rational fear. And I fully understand where it's coming from. Fear of a grand aggressor who attacked us in World War II, the Winter War and the War of Continuation, you know, a situation whereby we were able to maintain our independence, unlike our Baltic cousins or many Central and Eastern European countries. In the long term, we must understand the realities, and the realities on the ground are very simple. The security situation in Europe has changed fundamentally. It has taken a reverse tone to what happened in 1989. Then it was about, you know, freedom, it was about reconstruction, it was about markets, it was about champagne bottles and firecrackers and freedom and peace and democracy and the rest of it. Now we're going to see a Europe which is going to be split into two. On one hand, you have a totalitarian, authoritarian Russia, and on the other hand, we don't know where the sort of frontier is going to go. On the other hand, you have an alliance of democracies with various types of memberships in the European Union and in NATO. And you also know that in Finland, opinion polls on NATO changed overnight. We used to be 50 against, 20 in favor. Now the latest and third one that I saw yesterday, 2 days ago, 62 in favor, 16 against. So I keep on saying the train has left the station. It's not a question of if, but a question of when Finland will file an application to become a NATO member. But you also have to understand that for a small state, timing is an existential question. So you have to be very adamant about the time when you do that. And that's what I think our political leadership is doing at the moment. And the reason I say this, and I'll link it to Philip's question, Putin has three stated goals. One is the annexation and invasion of Russia, although of course Lavrov said that they're not even invading, but suspend the truth. Secondly, push back the frontiers of NATO. So Eastern and Central Europe out of NATO. And third, prevent Finland and Sweden from joining NATO. Well, of course, the exact opposite is happening now, but all I'm saying is that is his aim. And then, of course, there are these rhetorical threats that you have to take seriously because they've come from four people. Basically, that if Finland were to join NATO, there will be military technical repercussions, whatever that means, moving troops to our border or whatever it could be, information wars, etc., etc. And that message has come from Putin himself, from Lavrov, then from Zakharova, who's a spokesman at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, or MID in Moscow, and then actually from Sergei Belyayev, who is a former diplomat, as a Russian diplomat in Finland, and actually the interpreter in all of our meetings with the presidents and prime ministers. So, we take that threat seriously, but Philip, independence, don't push it that far. But military threat in the long run, yes, it's there. And that's why Finland is reassessing the security situation. And that's why I think a Finnish application for NATO membership is not going to be a matter of days. It's not going to be a matter of weeks. It's not going to be a matter of years, but it will be a matter of months.
And I think that it's fair to say that we cannot really talk about Finland today without talking about NATO. So it's great that you also reflected on that. Maybe just as a continuation on that, I think it could be interesting for our audience to understand why did Finland not join NATO in the years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, or at the latest when the Baltics joined? It's Finland clearly picked a side when it joined.
I think because there are probably going to be Finnish journalists on board there, so I should probably just shut up. I mean, Annika, you know that I've been in favor of Finnish NATO membership ever since I was born in 1968, right? No, I mean, I thought that Finland should have joined in 1995. And at the same time when we joined the European Union. You should also understand that, and I'm simplifying, for Sweden, joining the EU was about economics, right? It was about internal market and decision-making power. For us, it was a security political decision. We didn't frame it like that because it was still the sort of early days in the post-Cold War era. But you see, you also have to understand that for Finland, and again, we talk about, if not disinformation, at least propaganda. The way in which NATO was perceived during the Cold War in Finland was like this, military US-driven aggressor, right? I'm not saying that the Warsaw Pact was any better, but it certainly was not explained as an alliance of liberal democracies collectively taking care of their own defense, an organization which won the Cold War without firing a shot, an organization which has never been attacked from the outside, except of course 9/11. But it was seen as this, how would I say diplomatically, less than optimal security alliance. So there was this sentiment, and then for a lot of people it was also ideological. There were a lot of anti-Americans at the time, a little bit like in Greece to a certain extent, if I may use a comparison. But I wish we would have joined then. Then we would not have been in this thing. And then when the opinion polls were like they were, I mean, the times that I got sort of scolded for being pro-NATO, etc., they probably lost a lot of votes in it. But I always, stuck to my guns and said, yep, NATO is it. Now we have a Norwegian Secretary General, and we had a Danish one a little bit earlier, and I think it's a fairly peaceful organization. So I hope we'll join it soon. But it was a bit difficult. But it's better late than never, huh?
Yeah, and it is very interesting following the Finnish discussion at the moment. So it seems that the people are all for it at the moment, and the politicians are coming a bit slow behind the people.
Yeah, well, so, the funny thing there is that, even myself as probably if someone were to say, who is the #1 NATO advocate in Finland, and there was an opinion poll, I think I'd be quite high on that list. And now that I'm saying sort of that, hold your horses, we will join, but the time is not to do it right now, because we don't want to escalate the conflict to the northeastern part of Europe. I get people coming at me and, what the hell are you saying? So it's a little bit different. I should also explain to everyone online there that what we had in the post-Cold War era was what we call a NATO option. It's almost like jargon, but it basically meant that we had an option to join. So we wanted to have a military which was so compatible with NATO that it's actually more compatible than most of its member states at the moment. So we have our FATs, we just bought 64 F-35s, we do military exercises with NATO, we participated in all the NATO operations, basically Afghanistan and the rest of it. So the only thing we didn't have is decision-making power in NATO and Article 5 and collective defense. But we used the NATO option sort of as a repellent to the Russians, and saying that, listen, if you mess with us, we're going to join. But now, one of the security pillars of Finland, in other words, cordial and good relations with Russia, it's gone. We could have a couple of phone conversations with Putin, great, but boom, it's gone. And that means that the whole idea of a NATO option is gone as well. And I would say that there's only one option, and that is to join NATO. But the timing has to be impeccable here. There's no question about it.
The former NATO Secretary General Rasmussen has said that the window of opportunity to join is now. So we'll see where that Finnish discussion goes, when that application will go in. But certainly, like you said, the question is not if, but the question is when. So it's certainly worth to stay tuned on that. We have about 10 minutes, and in this remaining time, I have a long list of other issues I would have wanted to cover, but the one thing I would like to come back to is the path to the war. And I would like to hear your thoughts on what you think have been the biggest mistakes done on the side of the West and the EU in the last decades vis-a-vis Russia.
Well, I'm not a big fan of Mersheimer and the realist school of thinking. So the last thing I will say that it's the fault of the West that Russia is behaving the way in which it is. I don't think so. But there was a time, I think, when there was a window of opportunity for what I would call the Westernification of Russia. And that was not only during Yeltsin, but sort of around 2001, 2003, when Putin had just taken over power. And I think there was even this sentiment that, okay, we can do this. There were the NATO partnerships and councils with Russia, etc., etc. But then at some stage, something started to go sour. And it's easy again to go back with hindsight and say, should we have shown more respect to Russia? should we have integrated them better? Because there was always this sense in Russia that, and Russians are very bad at going through their own history and cleaning their mess. So, you know, the sort of purges of Stalin, etc., you know, the fact that he killed 25 million people, it's sort of not really ever dealt with. And you know, Russians, they never went through the Soviet era on how horrific that letter combination of CCCP actually was. And if we had perhaps then not sort of shoved it into the face of the Russians after the Cold War and been a bit more lenient, we could have avoided something. But that's the sort of the big picture, right? Then what were the mistakes? You know, we saw Putin's speech in Munich in 2007, which gave an indication about where he might want to go, but we sort of just brushed it off. Then in the war in Georgia, I think we should have seen, and you know, Annika, I did give a speech in August 2008. It's called 080808, where I basically made a claim that, you know, wake up Europe, wake up world, power politics, spheres of interest, military conflicts are back on the borders of Europe, and we should see Russia as an aggressor. But, you know, in Finland, I got scolded by, I'm not going to use the F word, but I will use the word perhaps old school foreign policy thinkers. Oh my God, how can a foreign minister say that? But the truth is that you know, that's when we should have reacted a little bit harder. But the problem was that, you know, a month after 080808, we had Lehman Brothers. So then the whole world was preoccupied with the financial crisis, and then for us, it became the Euro crisis. And the same thing happened then in 2014. I mean, the military operation of Putin in Crimea was, you know, historically good, and we did nothing about it, nor could we do anything about it. But now he's gone over the mark, and now we're beyond the point of no return. So, you know, Putin is the pariah of the world at the moment. You know, you can't, so now, you know, there's no sort of looking back anymore and what we should have done. But I'm sure there's a sort of a set of mistakes, and, you know, it takes quite a few people to tango at times, and we made our mistakes on the way. But I don't know how we would have done it different, gone a bit tougher on the sanctions or opened our doors to Russia a little bit earlier. I really don't know. But the sad thing that I find as a Finn, that is that, you know, I think there are a lot of people who are truly trying to have a good relationship with Russia and with Putin. And there was this feeling that, you know, we can do this. But you know, obviously we can't. And here you have to understand that a lot of it is about, if I may, you know, Russian DNA, culture, and history. So Russia has always been driven by, well, not always, but since the Romanovs, they've been driven by these sort of centralized authoritarian leaders, czars, who got their powers from God. And the system was extremely hierarchical. So you have one leader who says how things are done, and no one complains. Under that leader, you have the princes, political princes in forms of whatever government ministers and governors, and then economic princes in form of I guess, oligarchs. And there was this system of give and take that, you know, you were given something in order to show your allegiance to the Tsar. And this is what Putin wants to be. You know, he wants to be Stalin, or he wants to be remembered as Stalin or Peter the Great or Ivan the Terrible or whatever the case might be. And that's why he wants to unite Russia. I mean, I hate to use this term because it's make Russia great again. I mean, that's what he's trying to do, huh? But obviously he's made Russia miserable again. And the sad thing for me as a Finn is to look at my neighbors, and I'm not talking about Sweden here, to look at my neighbors and see that, you know, the guys just went 20, 30 years back in history. Overnight, they have destroyed everything that they built since the end of the Cold War. And this is not going to be rectified anytime soon, even if there is a regime change, which will have to happen from the inside if it ever happens. Final point on this. Remember that sometimes in regime change, the bad guy gets replaced by someone who's even worse and harder. That's what happened in 1991 with the junta that came in when Gorbachev was ousted. Then, of course, Yeltsin came in and stood on the tanks and the rest of it. But and we know Russian revolutions, they don't happen very often from the outside. They happen from the inside.
I recognize that we have 5 minutes, and I would like to finish off with final questions. So obviously, this is defining moment. In many ways, the European future will be determined now in Ukraine. So first of all, it would be interesting to know what kind of new beginnings do you envisage? And then also, how do you see the future European order? If we look at many of the mistakes done that led us to the war, we see that Germany together with France have certainly, as self-declared leaders of the EU, they played a huge role in letting EU sleepwalk into this war. So what role can they play? How can they rebuild their credibility? And if we really need reliable leaders, who would you turn to? And as a last one, if we recognize that this is a defining moment for Europe, what would be your message to the EU heads of state and government today about the measures to be taken now?
Lots of big questions.
I know.
I mean, just to start off with, I'm not at the stage yet where I've been able to get my mind around what the new global order is going to look like. I mean, we're all trying to find terms for it. I mean, the one that I've been using, I stole it from somewhere, is, the great fragmentation. I've been working on a book which now is kind of completely redundant. It was the New World Disorder, Power in the 21st Century. I guess I can do it now, but my thesis in that book was to say that we're seeing the emergence of a tripolar world: China, the United States, and Europe. And my focus was very much on tech, because much like Mark Leonard, I believe that we've entered an age of unpeace, where the line between war and peace is blurred and everything can be weaponized, including, energy that we've been talking about, technology, information, etc. So the European thing that we've always thought about this is very much sort of David Mitrani or Karl Deutsch thinking that connectivity will create a global community. But actually the things that were supposed to connect us, like trade and travel and language and internet and social media, they're actually driving us apart at the moment. So in the big picture, I don't know what the sort of setup is going to be. I don't believe it's going to be sort of China and Russia versus the rest of the world. That's overestimating Russia and underestimating China. But if you look at it from a governance perspective, one could say that there will probably be alliances of democracies versus then alliances of other systems. But my guess is, and this is just a hypothetical at this particular moment, my guess is that we're moving towards some kind of a regionalization of the world. So not a deglobalization as such, because you can't sort of kill the value chains immediately, but a regionalization, or if you use the internet term, a splinternet, right? So instead of having a world wide web and internet, you see a Chinese model emerging, you see perhaps a Western model emerging, and the different types of alliances that they have. So, we have a messy new world order or disorder. My final point, just to bring it into our little, European bubble, I do think, as I said earlier, that Europe will be split into two. And there's sort of a new iron curtain. I hate to use the term, but you have a totalitarian, authoritarian, completely isolated Russia. And we're looking at, if I may give a long-term perspective, I don't have the audacity to go beyond 10 years, but we will not forget this. We will have not forgotten this in 2032. And then on the other side, you have an alliance of democracies with various types of membership. The final point, everyone is talking about, oh, this was Putin trying to avoid Ukraine going into NATO. No, it was not. It was Putin trying to avoid the Europeanization of Ukraine. He did not want to see Ukraine as a liberal democracy. And that is why he's doing what he's doing at the moment. NATO is only a pretext. So in that sense, it's about the hearts and the minds and the souls of the Ukrainian, which now are much more European than Russian.
Absolutely. I think that this is a great point on which to end. In many ways, the Ukrainians, they're fighting for the values the EU stands for: democracy, freedom, human rights, rule of law. They've really proven to be true Europeans. So we can only hope that there will be solution to this war, and that Ukraine and that EU will be a very strong supporter of Ukraine, and will welcome Ukraine with open arms. That's one day into the club as
one
well.
of the things we forgot to mention: enlargement. It's always one of the most successful policies of the EU. Now it's more strategic than ever.
Absolutely, absolutely. There would have been so many more topics to cover, so we'll just have to find a time for you to come and join us again. But Alex Stubb, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for this insightful exchange, and thank you for sharing your reflections and thoughts. And certainly, this is a period we're in a crisis. We're still in a crisis mode. It's very difficult to think outside the box of where we may be going, etc. But it was great that we were able to do a bit of a reflection, what the implications could be for Finland, for Europe, for the future European order, for the global order maybe as well. So thank you so much for joining us, and really looking forward to having you at EPC, hopefully soon again.
Thanks for the invitation, and nice to try to get some clarity in my own thinking as well.
Thank you so much.